Hi there, welcome to Chapter 8 then of the Business and Finance course. Chapter 8 will be looking at business and personal finance. We'll be considering how a business is financed, so the different options that we have there. And then we'll think towards the end of the chapter then, just reasonably briefly actually, about personal finance and what you might have to consider when managing your own personal finance. It's just really one very short page at the end for that. So the big focus really is on business finance. Okay, so let's think about how I'm going to finance my business. So whatever business I have, let's imagine we're a relatively large business then. We really have two options. We have the option of having some shareholders, or I have the option of going to my bank and taking out a loan, say. Okay, now although that's just kind of two examples, that really sums up my overall choice, because a business has a choice of financing its operations or financing its activities using equity finance or using debt finance. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through those different options. So we'll consider, firstly, short-term versus long-term. But then we'll start thinking about the different sources of equity finance, the different sources of debt finance that a business may have, and also thinking about why equity or debt might be preferable for a particular business. Okay, so like I said there, business can be financed in one of two ways. Either by equity, so the owners of the business put some money in, or by debt. So I have somebody who lends me money. Now that's not always going to be in the form of a bank loan. In fact, often for a big business, it's not in the form of a bank loan. What we really need to recognize is I have to give, as a business, some sort of return to these people. So if you're going to buy shares in a business, you'll find that you get a return in one of two ways. You either have some sort of dividend paid out, so a share of the profits for the period, or you're going to see your share price increase. So even if a business doesn't pay out a dividend, it might take that money and invest it instead, and that will enable the product to do better, and therefore the price of the share will go up, and you could sell your shares then and have more money than you started with. Obviously, if you're going to have debt, you're going to have some sort of interest payment, and whether you choose debt or equity is often going to depend on which of these you'd rather take on. Okay, so let's think about that in terms of risk. So we know already that when we talk about risk, if you've got high risk, that tends to mean you're going to either receive or you're going to have to pay a high return. So if you're a business that's deemed a bit riskier than others, that's normally going to mean you have to give a bigger return back. And we can think about the risk that faces debt holders and equity holders and how that corresponds then to the return that we, the business, are going to have to give to them. So we start off with debt holders. Now, we say that debt holders face lower risk than equity holders. Okay, so debt holders face lower risk than equity holders, and therefore it goes hand in hand that they must get lower returns. Now, the reason they face lower risk is that they receive their interest payment before any dividend can be paid out. And even more than that, an interest payment is compulsory. So you have to pay your interest payments. You don't always have to pay a dividend. Another reason why debt holders are tending to face lower risk is that often the debt will be secured. So for example, my debt might be secured on a particular asset that I own. So perhaps a building or a vehicle or a piece of machinery. And what happens if I don't make my interest payments? The debt holder will just come and take away that asset. Okay, and they'll sell the asset, they'll get some money from that instead. So it just means that the chance of them leaving with nothing is much lower than a shareholder. So again, that makes it lower risk. Going one step further then, if the company were to fail, then if you're owed money, or if you're a debt holder for a business, then you're earlier in the list. So the list of people who get their money back when a business goes into difficulties, the debt holder will be much higher than equity holders. In fact, the equity holder is right down the bottom there. The only problem you're going to have then, if you are a debt holder, is that you get a lower rate of return. Okay, so you get a lower rate of return because you're taking on less risk. Equity risk then have a higher risk, but that means that they generally can enjoy higher returns. And one of the things you need to consider is that any loss that a business suffers is going to be suffered by the equity holders, because the debt holders will already have been paid their interest. However, if there's any profits extra, those are going to go to the shareholders. So just because the business has done well, the debt holder doesn't turn around and say, oh, I want a bit extra money this time. Okay, so you have to take the ups with the downs. Now, when you're trying to consider as a business what you want to do in terms of having debt or equity finance, you need to consider that the pros and cons of each for you. Okay. Now, when you think about the money that a business needs, we really need to break that down into things that they need immediately. So they need things in the month to pay wages and to pay off some of their suppliers. And they're also going to need money in the longer term. So they need to buy or make inventory. They need to offer credit terms to their customers. So in addition to kind of non-current assets, for example, they also have these almost permanent current assets. And that's what I want to talk about first of all, is this idea of financing my current assets. Okay. Now, if you're going to come up with a process for financing current assets, you really need to consider what current assets you have. And first thing to consider is that although your current assets by definition are short term, it's fair to say that most businesses will have a permanent level of current assets. So a business will also always have, a minimum amount of receivables or a minimum amount of inventory that they're holding. Now, when you're trying to decide how you're going to finance that, you obviously have the choice between long-term and short-term finance. If you focus on more long-term finance for your current assets, we would call that a defensive policy. And that's because it's relatively safe to have long-term finance for your current assets, but it can be more expensive or likely to be more expensive. If you focus on short-term finance, we would call that an aggressive finance policy. And that's because it's a bit cheaper, but it's risky. If I'm constantly having to renew my short-term finance, that can be risky for me as a business. Actually, it can be easier to think of this in terms of a diagram. So I've just quickly drawn up a diagram here looking at those two different approaches. So on the left here, we've got a more aggressive approach. And this is where we've got all of my fluctuating current assets and even some of my permanent current assets financed by short-term finance, and then some of my permanent current assets and all of my non-current assets financed by a long-term source of finance. Over on my defensive policy then, I've got much less of my assets, and even not all of my fluctuating current assets being financed by short-term finance, and the rest with long-term finance. So all of my non-current assets, all of my permanent current assets, and even some of my fluctuating current assets. Now, if we just stick to aggressive for a second, the reason that a company will do this is because short-term finance generally is cheaper than long-term finance. So this should lead to higher profitability. So I'm paying less for the finance that I have to obtain. However, certainly increased risk as well, because what happens if my lender decides that they're not going to renew my loan for my short-term loan, for example. With the defensive policy, we're on the other end of the scale. So although long-term finance is more expensive and therefore will damage my profits, it is much safer. So it's going to be lower risk as well. So I can get in a nice long-term loan and then not have to worry about having to renew it. And we'll have a look in a bit more detail at those in a little while as well. Okay, back into the notes then. And this is where we start to think about those relative costs. So we start off by looking at the cost of short-term finance. Now, like I said when we were looking at the diagrams, short-term finance is generally cheaper than long-term finance. And as always, that kind of return or that cost is linked to the risk that's being taken. So I know that if I have to lend somebody some money, for example, a nice basic example for a week, well, I know that not that much can happen to the economy in the week. I know that, as long as I know where this person lives, I know what business they're doing, the risk of them not paying me back is relatively low in the sense of the duration of the loan. If, however, they ask me to loan them money for 5 years, well, now I have to start thinking, well, what's this business going to be doing in the next 5 years? What's the economy going to be like in the next 5 years? what's going to happen to interest rates in the next 5 years because I've got an opportunity cost of lending to this person instead of lending to somebody else. So it's really important that we consider that, risk and return are going to be linked there. Now, the paragraph or the sentence underneath just points out that due to something or due to kind of this idea of expectations, so kind of expectations theory, it is possible for short-term interest rates to be higher than long-term, and that might be because we're expecting the base rate to fall over the period. So if I'm expecting interest rates generally to get lower over the next year, I'd expect my long-term interest rate to be lower than my short-term. In addition to the kind of risk-reward relationship, the flexibility of short-term finance might also reduce the overall cost, because long-term finance is quite difficult to repay early and often lots of costs included there. Also, finally, we can class payables as a short-term finance. So short-term finance in the form of payables is really low cost. So the fact that I'm getting some credit from my suppliers is a really nice way of kind of dealing with that working capital issue. Now, the only thing we do need to bear in mind is that if you're starting to pay your suppliers later and later and later, they're going to get a bit fed up with that. Now, although it's cheaper, we also need to consider the risks of short-term finance, and we kind of look at those in two terms here, in the sense of renewal risk and in the sense of interest rate risk. Now, if we just consider what we mean here, if I'm going to focus on using short-term finance, I'm going to have to renegotiate that finance quite often, almost continually. So if I've got a 30-day source of finance, I have to renegotiate that every 30 days. And that kind of gives me one big problem. First of all, what if I suddenly can't renew the loan? Okay, what if suddenly the bank says, actually, things have changed, you're no longer able to do that? So that's obviously going to be a big risk to me. Whoops. So I might suddenly be able to be unable to renegotiate my borrowing. And then obviously interest rates are going to be going up and down. And there's the risk that if I lock myself into short-term finance over and over, and if interest rates are going up and up and up, I'm going to constantly be paying a high interest rate. Whereas if I'd taken a nice long loan out at the start, I might have got it at a lower rate. So the fact that my interest rates might go up over the period. Okay, 2.4 then just kind of reiterates what we spoke about there when we were discussing financing my current assets, really. So when we talk about an aggressive policy between short and long-term finance, it means I have more short-term finance, which probably will give me a higher profit, but there's a lot more chance of me getting into trouble. A defensive policy will have more long-term finance, so will increase my liquidity, but my profitability will suffer. So this really is the key decision to be made, is between profitability and liquidity. Okay. 2.5 then goes a little further and starts thinking about whether or not I should hold on to cash. Now, obviously, holding cash is often going to be a problem for me because I could be doing something better than having cash in my very, very low interest rate bank account. And we say the cost of holding cash is basically whatever I could be doing instead. So instead of having it in the bank, what else could I be doing with that money? Okay, so that's key. The costs of running out of cash are going to vary, but tend to include loss of settlement discount. So for example, I might lose the option or lose the saving from paying early. So if I've got lots of cash around and my supplier calls me and says, look, if you pay today or if you pay in the next week instead of the next month, we'll let you have 1% off. A loss of supplier goodwill. So if I'm paying my suppliers late, that's going to cause me an issue. And if you kind of keep going with that, you're going to end up with your suppliers not wanting to supply anymore, and that's going to cause me a real problem. Likewise, if I don't pay my staff on time, that's going to cause problems. They're going to not be very motivated for me then, and eventually down the line, you might end up with a payable going as far as possible and trying to wind up the business. Now, in terms of whether or not we keep money or how much money or cash we keep, we tend to think of it for business and finance in the sense of these four motives. So these different motives for keeping cash. So we'll run through these, and you can think about this in the sense of, you know, your own finances at home too. When you think about your money for the month, certainly you'll consider, right, well, I need to keep enough cash for my expected day-to-day expenses. Okay, so for example, as a business, we need to make sure we've got enough money to pay my staff. We also might consider that I have to purchase some non-current assets, or I might have to repay a loan. So that would be my finance motive. Precautionary and investment are both what I would call kind of a just in case. Oops, not a just in case, it's not his name. Just in case. But they're for different reasons. So precautionary motive is just in case an unexpected expense arises. And the investment motive then is a just in case an unexpected opportunity arises. So those are the four motives for holding on to cash. 2.6, very last part of section 2 then, just thinking about investing my cash if I've got the surplus. So if you do your cash flow forecast and it comes out with a surplus, you really need to be thinking about what you're going to invest that money in. Okay, that's the end of this section then. So that's sections 1 and 2 of chapter 8. On the next recording then, we'll think about the banking system and the money market. So go and grab yourself a cup of tea and then we'll carry on the next recording.